Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a war most people have never heard of, but one that reshaped an entire region and still echoes in political borders and economic struggles today. So let me ask you this: how does a war over desert sands end up defining the future of three nations? Stick around, because the answer is buried deep in geography, minerals, and a whole lot of ambition. To understand the War of the Pacific, we first need to go back, way back, to the messy aftermath of Spanish colonial rule in South America. Imagine a continent freshly unshackled from European imperialism, but still chained to its colonial inheritance. The Andes Mountains, the towering spine of western South America, weren't just a stunning geological marvel. They were a massive natural divide, slicing countries in half, slowing down commerce, and isolating populations. Economically, it meant certain regions developed rapidly while others remained cut off. Politically, it created fragmented identities within newly formed countries, each with its own priorities and its own grievances. Now let's talk borders. Spanish colonial boundaries weren't drawn with future nation-states in mind. They were vague, often mapped with more imagination than precision. Nowhere was this more problematic than the Atacama Desert. It's rich in minerals, especially nitrates, and it became a ticking time bomb. No one really knew who owned what. Bolivia thought it had rights. Chile disagreed. Peru, of course, had interests of its own. At the center of this geographic drama was Bolivia's narrow strip of coastline. Yes, Bolivia used to have access to the Pacific Ocean. That tiny sliver of shore was protected by treaties, on paper, at least, but treaties can be slippery things when minerals and money are involved. And then there's Peru. Aligned closely with Bolivia, Peru had control over some of the most lucrative exports of the day, nitrates and guano. Yes, bird droppings were big business in the 19th century, and controlling them meant influence, leverage, and the kind of wealth that draws international attention. So here we are, a region shaped by jagged mountains, uncertain maps, strategic shorelines, and valuable dirt. The pieces were all on the board, and the players were circling. The question wasn't whether conflict would happen, but when, and over what pretext. So, why all the fuss over a dusty desert? Let's talk nitrates. In the mid-1800s, this humble mineral, found in massive quantities in South America's Atacama Desert, became the beating heart of two of the world's most important systems, agriculture and war. Nitrates were the key ingredient in fertilizer, critical for growing crops to feed booming populations across Europe and the Americas. But they were also essential for making gunpowder. So whether you were trying to put bread on the table or win a battle, nitrates had you covered. And just like that, this dry, desolate corner of South America became valuable, massively valuable. Between the 1860s and 1870s, global demand skyrocketed. The Industrial Revolution was in full swing. Farms needed to grow more. Armies needed to stockpile. Empires needed control. The Atacama's white gold wasn't just a local resource. It became a global obsession. But here's where things get even messier. It wasn't just South American governments eyeing this mineral boom. Foreign investors, particularly the British, poured money into the nitrate trade. Private companies sprang up, financed from London, aiming to extract, export, and profit. So now, we've got a volatile mix, three nations with unclear borders, a globally vital resource in the middle of nowhere, and foreign money fueling the flames. Add in conflicting economic models and political insecurity, and you've got a powder keg just waiting for a spark. All right, here comes the spark. In 1874, Bolivia signed a treaty with Chile. It was simple. For the next 25 years, Bolivia agreed not to raise taxes on Chilean companies operating in its coastal territory, especially those juicy nitrate firms. In return, Chile got economic predictability, and Bolivia got, well, peace. Sort of. But treaties, as history shows us time and time again, are only as strong as the incentives behind them. In 1878, Bolivia, strapped for cash and facing pressure to increase revenue, violated the treaty. They slapped a new tax on Chilean nitrate companies. Not just any companies, powerful ones, backed by foreign capital. This wasn't just a bureaucratic tweak. It was a provocation, a gamble, and Chile wasn't about to sit back. In February of 1879, Chilean forces moved quickly and decisively. They occupied the Bolivian port of Antofagasta, seizing assets and taking control of the disputed coastal zone. It wasn't a declaration of war, not yet. But let's be honest, it was close enough. Now here's where it gets even more tangled. Peru. Behind the scenes, Peru had signed a secret military alliance with Bolivia. So when Chile moved in, Peru was trapped. If they stood by, they'd betray Bolivia. But if they joined the fight, it meant war with Chile, a rising regional powerhouse. Chile, knowing this, issued a bold demand: declare neutrality or face consequences. Peru hesitated. Chile didn't. By April 1879, the War of the Pacific was fully underway, triggered not by bloodshed or ideology, but by taxation, treaties, and resource control. A war born in the boardroom, not the battlefield. Now let's step back and look at what really set these nations apart. This wasn't just a territorial dispute. It was a clash of economic worldviews, central planning versus market enterprise. And that difference? It shaped everything. Let's start with Bolivia. Their government, desperate for revenue and increasingly reliant on state control, chose to ignore treaty obligations and tax foreign nitrate firms. It was a bold move, but one rooted in central authority. Bolivia prioritized government expansion over honoring private contracts, and that decision sent a clear signal: stability of enterprise was secondary to state needs. Now look at Peru. Years earlier, Peru had nationalized its guano industry. Instead of letting private companies compete, the government took control of production and exports. Sound familiar? It's a classic case of what economists today call resource nationalism, the belief that the state, not the market, should control wealth beneath the soil. Both Bolivia and Peru embraced the idea that government, not entrepreneurs, should call the economic shots. But Chile? Chile chose a different path. Chile aligned itself with private enterprise. It backed the very firms that Bolivia sought to tax. Instead of squeezing them for state revenue, Chile empowered them, encouraged investment, and used that capital to modernize and grow. Their economy thrived not by controlling markets, but by enabling them. This difference wasn't just philosophical, it became structural, and when war came, it meant one side had flexibility, investment, and incentives working in tandem, and the other, bureaucracy, debt, and instability. Which side would you bet on? So, war has broken out. But this wasn't a chaotic skirmish of equal powers. From the start, Chile had the edge, and not just by luck, but by systems. Let's begin with the sea. Chile's navy was the most modern in South America. While Bolivia had no navy at all and Peru's fleet was aging and scattered, Chile's ships ruled the Pacific. That meant control over trade routes, troop movements, and coastal cities. Think about that. If your enemy can't get supplies, can't reinforce troops, can't even send messages by sea, how long can you hold out? Now factor in infrastructure. Chile had built up railways and telegraph lines, tools of industrial warfare that turned distance into an advantage. And with foreign capital flowing in, Chile had access to modern European arms and equipment. Their army didn't just march, they communicated, coordinated, and struck with precision. But here's the secret sauce: institutional strength. While Bolivia's government was fragmented and Peru's leadership often paralyzed by internal disputes, Chile had a unified civil-military strategy. Civilian leaders and generals weren't fighting each other, they were working together. Policies were aligned, goals were clear, and when you're fighting a war, that kind of coherence is everything. So, while their rivals stumbled through bureaucracy and confusion, Chile advanced with lethal efficiency. This wasn't just a war of bullets and boats, it was a war of systems, and Chile's system was built to win. And just like that, when the smoke cleared, everything had changed. Let's start with Chile. Victorious and emboldened, Chile annexed vast territories, most notably the resource-rich Atacama Desert and the Peruvian province of Tarapacá. These weren't just lines on a map. These regions contained the very nitrate fields that had triggered the war. The spoils weren't symbolic, they were strategic. With control over exports and ports, Chile's economy boomed. War had been profitable, but not just because of conquest. It was the infrastructure, the institutions, and yes, the open embrace of enterprise that allowed Chile to absorb and manage these new lands effectively. While others taxed or nationalized, Chile exported. Now contrast that with Bolivia. Defeated and humiliated, Bolivia lost its entire coastline. To this day, yes, even now, Bolivia remains landlocked. The economic effects were devastating. No access to the sea meant higher trade costs, lower competitiveness, and a kind of permanent dependency on neighbors. The war didn't just take territory, it redefined Bolivia's future. And Peru? Peru was gutted. Its military was shattered. Lima was occupied. Economically, the war accelerated its decline. Peru had already been struggling under nationalized guano revenues, and now it had lost critical export zones. Political instability followed. Regime changes, debt crises. The war exposed the fragility of a system built on centralized control and one precious resource. So who won? On paper, Chile. But zoom out, and you'll see something deeper. This war reordered regional power, realigned economic models, and left generational scars. And those borders we see today, still haunted by these consequences. Now let's zoom out, because the War of the Pacific isn't just a one-off event. It's part of a much larger pattern. A pattern that shows up again and again in history whenever three forces collide: resources, centralized control, and foreign money. Start with the resource. In this case, nitrates. But it could just as easily be oil, gold, lithium, or rare earth metals. Whenever a single commodity becomes crucial to global markets, the region that controls it becomes a magnet for profits, for politics, and for power struggles. Now add centralization to the mix. Both Bolivia and Peru tried to manage their resources from the top down. Governments nationalized, taxed, restricted, and intervened, all with the intention of protecting the national interest. But in doing so, they often undermined the very economic vitality that made those resources valuable in the first place. Contracts became unstable, investment dried up, political trust collapsed. Meanwhile, Chile's more decentralized, enterprise-friendly approach allowed market incentives to guide development, creating flexibility in how the country absorbed foreign capital and managed expansion. They didn't avoid all problems, of course, but their system aligned state interest with market behavior, and that made a difference. And then there's the wildcard, foreign capital. British and European investors didn't care about borders or treaties. They cared about profit margins. And when profits were threatened by taxes or nationalization, they pressured governments, supported interventions, or simply pulled out, leaving fragile economies to crumble. This war teaches a powerful truth. When centralized regimes try to control resource flows in a globalized market, the system becomes brittle. One tax hike, one treaty violation, one misstep, and the whole thing unravels. The War of the Pacific wasn't just a fight over land. It was a case study in how systems collapse when politics tries to override economics. So, who really wins a war like this? Chile gained territory, yes. Resources? Absolutely. But even they had to reckon with the long-term costs, militarization, dependency on a single export, and a geopolitical rivalry that never quite disappeared. Peru and Bolivia? Their losses were devastating. Peru never fully regained its economic footing, and Bolivia, still landlocked to this day, bears the scar in both trade and national identity. For them, this war wasn't just a defeat, it was a transformation, one that weakened state institutions and deepened economic fragility. But let's ask the deeper question, was this war inevitable, or was it the product of short-sighted decision-making, fueled by over-centralized control, political egos, and the desire to wring just a little more tax revenue out of a booming industry? It's easy to look at maps and treaties, but the real story is in the systems, in how governments structured their economies, managed risk, and responded to pressure. War became the answer, not because it was right, but because no one had built institutions strong enough to resist it. And here's the final twist. While nations bled, foreign investors often walked away with their profits intact. Resource wars tend to leave graves and debts at home, and dividends abroad. So what does that mean for us? It means history has a message. When central authorities overreach, when economic systems ignore market realities, and when politics weaponizes trade, conflict isn't far behind. If we want peace, it may not come from more control, but from letting go. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If this story got you thinking, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe for more history that digs deeper than the textbooks. And if you'd rather listen on the go, check out the podcast version, linked in the description. Curious what happened in other forgotten wars? Or how one economic decision led to the collapse of empires? We've got episodes for that. See you in the next one.